A candle flame flickers in total darkness, its light revealing a single drop of thick black ink falling onto yellowed parchment. The ink spreads slowly, forming a grotesque stain resembling an open wound. The camera lingers on it, as if the stain itself is trying to breathe. The darkness shifts to a rotting floorboard inside an abandoned convent in rural Virginia, year 1862. The boards are warped, splintered, and pulled upward by time, making a jagged mouth in the floor. Beneath them sits a corroded iron chest, chained shut even as rust devours its edges. The lid is engraved with a Latin phrase, Deus non audit, God does not listen. The chest is pried open, and the world narrows around what lies inside. A journal wrapped in linen soaked permanently with dried blood. The pages are curled inward as though recoiling from the stories kept within. On the first page, in fading ink, sits the name Sister Miriam Grace, age 51, a nun once celebrated for her discipline, austerity, and her devotion to silence. Her peers called her the Silent Saint, a woman who prayed until her knees bled and fasted until her body trembled. But the handwriting beneath her name does not belong to her. The letters are uneven, tentative, and riddled with childish mistakes. The writer is a young enslaved boy, his existence unrecorded anywhere else in history except here. His final entry is erratic and smeared. Sister says her blessing comes from heaven. But heaven has eyes that stare at me. The convent of St. Aurelia stood alone on the edge of Blackwater Marsh, its stone walls rising like a fortress against the decaying wilderness around it. Though built in 1819, its design carried echoes of older, medieval intentions: narrow corridors, small windows, and doors reinforced not to protect those inside, but to confine them. Townspeople whispered that the building never belonged on American soil, that it was transplanted brick by brick from a European ruin and reassembled by hands that had long since turned to dust. Records from the era describe the convent as a place of holy rigor, but the locals who lived near the marsh called it something else: the Silent House. They claimed no laughter ever drifted from its walls, no music, no hymns, only the persistent scrape of wooden rosaries against stone as the sisters walked, praying in endless circles around the interior courtyard. Inside those walls, Sister Miriam Grace held absolute authority. Though she was not the abbess, her influence permeated every decision, every ritual, every act of discipline. She was the one who oversaw the orphan girls, the laboring women, the enslaved workers brought in from nearby plantations to maintain the fields and wells. She spoke rarely, but when she did, her voice carried an unsettling certainty, an unwavering belief that suffering purified the soul. But the journals and fragments left behind suggest something else entirely. The convent hid more than rituals. It hid disappearances. Children who arrived never left. Records ended abruptly. Names were crossed out with strokes so violent they tore the page. Among those bound to the convent's service was a boy no older than 14, named Eli. His skin was dark as the midnight marsh, his body slight, but his eyes carried the weight of generations. He had been sent from a nearby plantation after his parents were sold away, left with nothing but a fear he could not name. Sister Miriam Grace took notice of him immediately, not for his strength, but for his obedience, his silence, the way he moved as if already hollowed from the inside. She assigned him to menial tasks at first, polishing brass, scrubbing floors, tending the cold stone halls. But soon, she began to teach him in secret. Latin prayers, the ways of the convent, the esoteric texts she kept hidden from the other sisters. Eli's hands, so small, traced the pages of forbidden knowledge that no child should ever understand. He grew taller, stronger, more aware of the unseen currents in the convent's stone veins. And then, one autumn morning, the world shifted. The journals recorded in trembling script. She says the angel touched her. She calls it a blessing, but the blessing screams at me in the night. Sister Miriam Grace, aged 51, claimed she was pregnant. Eli's presence was always at her side, though the circumstances are left deliberately vague. The journal's entries become erratic, shifting from ritualistic reverence to panic. The angels do not bleed, the boy writes. I do not know whose child it is, but it moves in me and through me, and no one will ever see it. Within the convent's walls, a covenant had been broken. one that would ripple outward, tainting faith, memory, and the marsh itself. The convent's orphanage was a labyrinth of narrow corridors and hidden alcoves. Children lived in dormitories where the light barely touched the floors. Their laughter, when it appeared, was fleeting and brittle, quickly swallowed by the stone walls. Sister Miriam Grace monitored them closely, her presence like a shadow cast over every bed, every whispered prayer, every stolen glance. Eli watched from the periphery, a silent observer among the frightened and the forgotten. The journals described the orphans as small vessels of sin and sorrow, though the words carry the boy's own terror. Each night, the children would whisper about figures moving silently through the halls, cloaked in habit and candlelight. Some claimed to see a child, pale, swollen, with eyes too wide for innocence, vanish into the convent walls as though swallowed by the building itself. The convent's walls, Eli wrote, were alive in some unnatural sense. They exhaled cold, damp air that carried the scent of decay. Floors creaked with footsteps no one had taken. And always, the sense of being watched, of unseen hands tracing the edges of their lives, remained. Sister Miriam Grace was both mother and warden. She enforced strict rules, obedience, silence, and the devotion of every child's body and mind to the church. But beneath her meticulous control, the journals reveal a growing obsession. The boy noted how her prayers became increasingly desperate, her visions fevered, her instructions darkened with fear. And through it all, the unborn child she claimed as divine grew. Its presence whispered in shadows, a hidden terror the children could not name, but somehow felt, creeping behind their ribcages like a living, restless thing. Beyond the convent, Blackwater Marsh stretched endlessly, a tangled web of reeds, mud, and stagnant water. Locals rarely dared enter after dusk. The fog seemed alive, twisting into forms that suggested faces, hands, and impossible shapes moving just beyond sight. The journal entries record the convent's relationship with the marsh as symbiotic, almost predatory. Sister Miriam Grace walked its edge nightly, muttering prayers that Eli could not fully understand, tracing patterns in the mud that matched the strange symbols in her hidden texts. Eli wrote of noises carried across the marsh, a soft crying that rose with the wind, indistinct but unmistakably human, a low, wet scraping sound that made him shiver even in daylight. He traced it to the edge of the water, to pools where reflections trembled unnaturally. In these reflections, the boy swore he saw not his own face but that of Sister Miriam, swollen and unrecognizable, her eyes hollow with something older than grief, older than sin. The child within her, she claimed, was divine, a blessing from forces no one dared name aloud. But Eli recorded its presence differently, a heat that pressed through the convent walls, a movement beneath floorboards, a shadow that lingered even in the brightest halls. At night, it seemed to breathe alongside them, matching the rhythms of the children's heartbeats, echoing every sigh. The journals hint at rituals performed on the marsh's edge, candles placed in patterns no human hand should trace, incantations that summoned the cold fog to curl around her body like a lover. Each entry descends further into panic, as Eli begins to understand that whatever was growing inside Sister Miriam was not meant for the world above water and stone. It belonged to the marsh itself. Deep within the convent, past the dormitories and the classrooms, lay an abandoned chapel. Its roof sagged, stained glass shattered in jagged shards, and the altar was warped with decades of damp. No candles had burned there in years, yet the air carried the faint coppery scent of blood, as if the chapel remembered the prayers it had never been offered. Eli discovered it one morning, following the boy's instinct to hide from the ever-watchful Sister Miriam. The floorboards groaned underfoot, releasing clouds of dust that clung to his lungs. On the altar lay objects that made him pause: a small silver knife, dulled with age but sharp enough to draw blood, a bundle of letters tied with black ribbon, the edges charred, and an assortment of wax figurines, each marred by deep, deliberate cuts. He wrote that when Sister Miriam found him there, her expression was not of anger, but of awe. She traced the knife along the altar as if conducting a symphony of unseen forces. Her eyes glinted, fevered with an intensity that frightened even him. She spoke then of the child, claiming that it would bring salvation, that the blood on the altar was a necessary offering, that the chapel itself had chosen her. The journals become increasingly fragmented here. Eli's handwriting shakes, blots of ink obscuring entire words. He notes movements that he cannot explain, shadows stretching beyond their sources, the altar trembling under invisible weight, and the faint echo of a child's laughter reverberating through the chapel long after he had fled. The abandoned chapel, once sacred, had become a nexus, a place where faith, obsession, and a hidden terror converged, and where the unborn child's presence was already impossible to ignore. Sister Miriam's visions grew more vivid with each passing week. Eli described them in trembling entries, shadows crawling along walls, figures draped in black, and faces of children who had vanished, eyes wide, mouths open in silent screams. Sometimes, in the corner of a sunlit room, he saw her staring past him, lips moving as if conversing with someone unseen. The journals suggest the child inside her was more than flesh. It seemed to command the air around her, bending the convent's light, turning warm rooms suddenly cold, stirring the stagnant dust in impossible swirls. Eli wrote that the child's presence was like a heartbeat beneath his own skin, echoing in the halls, marking time no human could measure. Sister Miriam began weaving a ritualized life, isolating herself in hidden chambers, tracing symbols across walls in blood and wax. She would call the children to witness, claiming their presence sanctified her purpose. Eli records the girls' silent compliance, their bodies trembling, their eyes locked on hers, as if hypnotized. At night, the convent itself seemed to respond. Doors closed on their own, windows rattled without wind, and the shadows lengthened to impossible proportions. The boy's writing grows erratic. He describes a sensation of being watched not by one person, but by a host of entities hiding in the stone, the wood, the marsh beyond. Through it all, Eli sensed the creeping inevitability of the child's arrival. It was neither divine nor innocent. It was something older, a lingering corruption that had waited centuries for a body, and now, through Sister Miriam, it had found one. Beneath the convent, accessed only through a narrow trapdoor hidden behind the refectory, lay a cellar that Eli never knew existed at first. The stairs descended into darkness so complete that even the candlelight trembled and died. The air smelled of damp earth, decay, and something acrid, metallic, like old blood. The journals describe the cellar as a place Sister Miriam called Sanctum Tenebris, the sanctuary of darkness, a hidden chamber for purposes no one else was meant to witness. Inside, the walls were lined with shelves holding jars of preserved animals, bones etched with strange symbols, and bundles of cloth wrapped around objects that refused description. Eli writes of a strange warmth radiating from the floor, as if the earth itself pulsed with an unseen life. At its center stood a makeshift altar, stained black with wax, and something darker, the surface scratched with scratches too deep to be accidental. Sister Miriam performed her secret rites here. The journals record sequences of movements, gestures, and chants, each meant to invoke forces that had no place in God's heaven. The boy's observations become increasingly fragmented. He notes shadows moving independently, whispers he cannot attribute to any human, and a heat rising from the altar that seemed to breathe alongside them. The unborn child, he writes, was present even here. The walls themselves seemed to recognize its power, reverberating with a rhythm that matched the slow, relentless thrum in Miriam's body. Eli understood then that the cellar was more than a room. It was a crucible. Within its walls, faith, corruption, and life itself collided, and nothing that entered ever emerged unaltered. Eli began to notice scratches on the convent's walls, tiny, almost imperceptible marks at first, etched along doorframes and in corners where shadows pooled. They were not random. Some formed patterns, sigils that seemed to pulse with a hidden life. He traced them with his fingers, feeling grooves that were impossibly deep for mere nails. And sometimes faint warmth radiated from the stone, as if the building itself were breathing. The journal suggests that the scratches were warnings, messages from those who had come before, or perhaps remnants of past horrors trapped in the walls. Eli writes that at night, these markings appeared to shift, lines elongated, symbols merged, and in the flickering candlelight, They sometimes resembled faces, eyes hollow, mouths twisted in silent screams. Sister Miriam never spoke of these markings, yet she walked past them with reverence. Eli sensed that she understood more than she revealed, that she conversed with the building in a silent language of blood, wax, and ink. In one entry, he notes seeing her press her palm to a scratched symbol and whisper words that made the air thicken around them. The boy became increasingly obsessed with the walls, realizing they were alive in a terrifying sense, recording secrets no human hand could truly erase. Each mark felt like a pulse, a warning, a heartbeat of the child growing within her, a presence that seemed to reach outward, scratching, demanding recognition. By the end of the month, Eli writes, he could no longer sleep in rooms where the walls carried these markings. The scratches were not only evidence, they were a mirror, reflecting the corruption that had rooted itself inside Sister Miriam, inside the convent, inside the marsh itself. In the main hallway of the convent, hidden behind a velvet drape, hung a tall mirror framed in tarnished silver. Eli wrote that he never looked into it willingly at first. Its surface was too deep, too black, reflecting not the room but the weight of everything that had happened within the walls. On certain nights, he swore he saw the mirror breathe, its reflection rippling as though something alive was trapped beneath the glass. Sister Miriam's image would appear there, but distorted. Her swollen belly hinted at a child that should not exist, her eyes wide with both rapture and terror. Sometimes, her reflection moved independently of her body, gesturing toward him, calling him to watch, demanding that he witness what was coming. Eli tried to look away, but the mirror forced him into its gaze. The journals described strange occurrences, the mirror fogging without cause, handprints appearing on its surface when no one had touched it, glimpses of a child crouched behind Sister Miriam, its small face pressed to hers, visible only in the reflection. Eli records trembling attempts to describe the child, part human, part something older, shadows curling around its limbs like black tendrils. He writes that the mirror became a focal point, a place where past and present collided. The building itself seemed to feed the visions, bending light and perception to reveal the unborn child's reality before it fully entered the world. The hallway became a place of dread, where every step echoed with anticipation and terror, a prelude to the irrevocable corruption that waited for birth. Eli's journal details how Sister Miriam's devotions changed as her pregnancy progressed. No longer were her prayers quiet, disciplined repetitions. They became violent, corporeal acts. Her fingernails dug into her palms until blood ran freely. She smeared it along her rosary beads, tracing the crucifix with trembling, red-stained fingers. Candles, once meant for light and guidance, were now consumed in rituals of desperation, their wax dripping into shapes Eli could barely comprehend. The boy wrote that he watched from the shadows, heart pounding as the convent seemed to pulse with each act. The blood was not solely hers. Sometimes it bore traces of the marsh's soil or of other substances he could not name. Each ceremony, each gesture, seemed to strengthen the presence that grew inside her. Children, when called to witness, were silent. They knelt in rigid lines, their faces pale, eyes fixed on Miriam as though hypnotized. Eli noted that their compliance was not born of fear alone. It was a recognition of the unnatural power emanating from her, and from the child she claimed as divine. The boy's entries grow frantic. He scribbles of whispered movements in empty halls, of shadows detaching themselves from the walls, of rooms that shivered with invisible touch. He begins to understand that the blood, the prayers, the chanting, they are not merely ritual. They are offering, a feeding of some ancient force waiting in the marrow of the convent stones. And always, in the margins of his journal, Eli sketches a small shape, the child's form, grotesque, unreal, yet unmistakably alive, pressing outward, demanding to be seen. As the months passed, Eli began to feel the child's presence even when Sister Miriam was not nearby. It moved in the corners of rooms, stretched along hallways, and lurked behind heavy curtains. He could sense it before he saw it. A pulse, a cold press against his chest, a shadow that clung to him with intent. The journals describe nights when the convent itself seemed to obey the child. Doors would swing open or slam shut without wind. The floorboards groaned beneath invisible weight. Candles sputtered as though struggling to survive the darkness that pressed into every crack and crevice. Eli writes that he could hear faint, wet sounds emanating from within walls. Soft sucking noises, small feet scuffing the floors, whispers too low to comprehend. Sister Miriam's own demeanor changed. She no longer moved like a human bound by time or gravity. Her gait was deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if the child were guiding her movements. In the mirror's reflection, Eli saw her shadow stretch unnaturally, merging with something small and twisted at her feet, something that was unmistakably not her own. The boy attempted to describe the child's shape, but the words failed him. It was neither fully human nor fully spirit. Limbs seemed too long, fingers curling in impossible angles, eyes that reflected light yet absorbed it simultaneously. It radiated both awe and terror, and Eli feared it would consume the convent, and them, long before birth. By now, the convent had become a crucible of anticipation and dread. Every stone, every shutter, every candle was aligned to the presence within Miriam. The unborn child's shadow had claimed the building, and nothing within it would remain unmarked by its existence. Though Sister Miriam held immense sway, she was not the abbess. The woman in charge, Mother Genevieve, remained distant, a figure of authority and fear, yet she seemed blind, or unwilling, to notice the changes consuming Miriam. Eli's journal suggests that Genevieve had her own secrets, hidden deeper than the convent walls, secrets that might have made her complicit in the horrors unfolding. Mother Genevieve rarely descended into the lower halls, preferring the sunlight corridors above. Yet the boy noticed a strange pattern. Her arrival always coincided with Miriam's ritualistic fervor, her subtle nods and gestures almost approving, as though some understanding passed between them in silence. The journals hint at a covenant older than either woman, a code bound by blood, obedience, and hidden knowledge. Eli wrote of overhearing whispers behind closed doors, fragmented phrases. It must be done. The legacy cannot end. The child carries the truth we cannot speak. These words carried a weight that pressed on him, an oppressive certainty that the unborn child was not an aberration, but a continuation of something ancient, a generational inheritance of power and corruption that the convent had safeguarded in darkness. The boy records growing unease. Walls seemed to tilt, doors no longer aligned, windows reflecting impossible angles. He became convinced the convent itself was reshaping to accommodate the unborn child, bending around its presence. The building, the abbess, and Miriam, all conspired in a silence that screamed across centuries. By this point, Eli understood that no confession, no escape, no appeal to God would undo what was unfolding. The secrets of the abbess, the rituals of Miriam, and the presence in her womb were inexorably entwined, preparing to emerge into the world with devastating consequence. One night, the convent fell into a darkness unlike any Eli had witnessed. The journal notes that the air itself thickened, pressing against his skin, making each breath a labor. The candlelight flickered violently, then went out entirely, leaving the halls illuminated only by a spectral glow emanating from the altar in the hidden cellar. Sister Miriam moved through the shadows with a purpose that was terrifying in its serenity. Eli wrote that her steps left no sound, yet the floorboards groaned as if the building resented her passage. Around her, the children knelt in rigid formations, their eyes wide, reflecting the faint green light that danced across the stone walls. The unborn child's presence became undeniable. It moved independently of Miriam, shifting the air, bending shadows to its will. Eli records seeing elongated shapes stretching from Miriam's body, curling around the children, brushing against the walls, pressing into the floor like smoke seeking escape. He writes that the convent groaned in response, as though the building itself had entered into a convulsive trance, aware of the child's power. Something changed that night. The journal describes a sound, or perhaps a feeling, like the snapping of time, a subtle but irreparable distortion in reality. Eli felt his own body tremble in sync with the child's heartbeat, the pulse echoing through every stone, every crevice, every marrow of the building. By dawn, the halls were silent again, But the journal notes that the convent would never be the same. The Night of Shadows had claimed it, bending both the sacred and the profane into a singular, unholy purpose. As the pregnancy advanced, Eli began to perceive the child's influence beyond mere presence. The journals describe objects moving without contact, books sliding from shelves, candles toppling, doors creaking open and shut on their own. Shadows twisted unnaturally, lengthening and bending as if pulled by an invisible hand. Sister Miriam's control over the convent intensified. She seemed to act not of her own volition, but guided by something coiled within her womb. The children, too, moved with a synchronized precision, their gazes fixed on Miriam as if awaiting commands that transcended speech. Eli observed them in terror, scribbling frantic notes of shapes and movements that defied logic. Elongated limbs in the corner of a room, whispers that carried no source, and shadows that clung to walls like wet cloth. The journals reveal Eli's growing understanding. The child was not merely unborn, it was already exercising dominion over its environment, bending reality to its will. It left traces, faint but undeniable, warmth radiating from the stone floors, sudden drafts that carried whispers, fleeting glimpses of movement at the periphery of vision. The convent, in all its austere sanctity, had become a vessel for a force that neither God nor man had sanctioned. Eli writes of a night when he touched the child's shadow, a chilling, intangible pressure that seemed to seep into his very bones. The sensation lingered long after he pulled away, a reminder that what was growing inside Sister Miriam's body had already begun to reach outward, claiming dominion over flesh, stone, and mind. By now, fear had transformed into something darker, a grim awareness that nothing within the convent would remain untouched when the child finally emerged. Eli began to sense that the convent itself had become alive in response to the child. He wrote that the walls pulsed faintly, as if veins carried an unseen current beneath the stone and mortar. The floorboards creaked with deliberate intention, the air thickened and swirled, and the shadows deepened into shapes that felt almost sentient. Every corner seemed to watch. Every door felt as though it could close on its own, trapping him in the labyrinthine halls. Sister Miriam moved through this living structure with an intimate understanding, tracing routes unknown to anyone else, touching walls and floors as if speaking to the building itself. Eli recorded that she sometimes pressed her hands against the stones and muttered in a language older than the convent, a tongue that seemed to awaken the very architecture around her. The child within her had become an axis around which reality bent. Eli's entries describe objects floating slightly when no one watched, whispers of names that had long been erased, and glimpses of figures appearing and disappearing at the edges of his vision. Even the children in the dormitories felt its presence, sometimes stiffening mid-motion, eyes locking onto empty corners where shadows convulsed with life. Eli concluded that the convent, the child, and Sister Miriam were inseparable, three entities intertwined in an unnatural harmony of fear, devotion, and corruption. The journal records a final observation before the next night. The walls themselves seemed to pulse in rhythm with the unborn child's heartbeat, a living map of influence that extended to every stone, every crevice, every hidden chamber. In this moment, Eli understood fully that the convent no longer belonged to humans. It belonged to the child. The journals grow frantic as the time of birth approaches. Eli writes that the air in the convent vibrated with anticipation, thick with the scent of damp stone, wax, and something far older. Sister Miriam, once human in movement and demeanor, now seemed entirely possessed, her gestures precise and inhumanly deliberate. Her body shivered and arched as if the child were commanding her, not the other way around. Eli describes the moment the child emerged in terrifying detail. The convent's hidden cellar became a theater of unnatural light, the walls glowing faintly from within, shadows flaring and retreating as though performing for some unseen audience. The child's first cries were absent. Instead, the air pulsed like a living heartbeat, vibrating against the floors and walls. Its form was both human and impossible, limbs too long, fingers curling in unnatural angles, eyes that seemed to absorb and reflect simultaneously, a skin that shimmered with wet, dark iridescence. The The children and Eli watched in silent horror. They could not scream. Their bodies were locked by a force older than any fear they had known. The child's gaze swept across the room, acknowledging them, claiming them, bending reality with a subtle, irresistible force. Sister Miriam's face reflected rapture and terror simultaneously. Her journal entries end abruptly, filled with repetitive scrawls of symbols, and the word chosen repeated until the ink ran dry. Eli's final words note that the convent itself seemed to breathe in response to the child's presence, alive with the corruption that had been gestating for months. The convent was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a tomb, a womb, and a throne for a presence beyond salvation. After the child's birth, the convent itself changed. The journals describe halls that twisted in impossible angles, rooms that seemed to rearrange themselves, and shadows that moved independently of any light. The very air carried a low hum, a resonance that pulsed in time with the child's heartbeat, as if the building had become an extension of its will. Eli wrote that the child's influence was total. Objects lifted, doors slammed, and even the walls seemed to shift subtly, bending toward it, accommodating its presence. The children, who had once knelt silently during rituals, now moved in synchronized obedience, their expressions vacant, their bodies instruments of a force they could not comprehend. Sister Miriam, pale and trembling, remained a figure of devotion, worshipping the child as both deity and terror. Eli noted that she sometimes spoke to it in a whisper, words unintelligible, yet the tone carried authority and awe. Her eyes reflected a mind fractured by the weight of the unnatural, yet utterly devoted to the entity she had birthed. The journals reveal a sense of inevitability. The convent was no longer merely a building. It was a living, breathing vessel for the child, a nexus where the sacred and the profane had fused into something neither fully human nor divine. Eli's final entries for this period hint at the ultimate realization. The child's presence was permanent, unyielding, and expanding. Every corner, every stone, every shadow had been claimed. There was no returning to the world as it had been. The convent, the child, and the memories of those who lived within its walls were now inseparably intertwined, forming a singular, unholy continuum. After Eli's last entry, the convent fell into abandonment. Locals claimed that no one dared enter for decades, that even the bravest hunters and wanderers would flee upon seeing the blackened, twisted structure at the edge of Blackwater Marsh. The walls, warped and alive, seemed to pulse faintly under moonlight, as though keeping vigil over something no living human should witness. Rumors spread across the surrounding towns, faint cries drifting through fog, shadows glimpsed through shattered windows, and a figure of a woman wandering the halls, pale, trembling, eyes empty, yet fixated on some invisible presence. Some said Sister Miriam had vanished along with the child. Others whispered that she had remained, a permanent guardian, consumed by devotion and terror, her body now only a vessel for the entity she had birthed. The child's existence became legend, but one marked by fear rather than worship. Travelers who dared the marsh reported fleeting glimpses of unnatural forms moving in the mist, long-limbed and impossibly silent. Scholars, when investigating the convent decades later, found walls etched with symbols that defied comprehension, floors imprinted with shapes too grotesque for human anatomy, and traces of blood that seemed to resist decay. Eli's journal, when discovered years later, offered the only account of what truly transpired. It became a chilling testament to the corruption that can flourish under the guise of sanctity, to the ancient forces lurking in places of faith, and to a child born not into light, but into shadows that would never release its grip. The convent stands still today, a silent monument, a mausoleum for forbidden knowledge, and a reminder that some presences, once invited, can never be exorcised. Eli's final journal entries speak of a silence that was suffocating, a quiet more profound than any absence of sound. The convent, now fully transformed by the child, had become a monument to secrets too terrible to name. Shadows moved like liquid along the walls, the floorboards groaned as though under the weight of 1,000 hidden footsteps, and the air itself vibrated with a presence that was at once omnipotent and unseen. The child, now visible only in glimpses, was no longer bound to Miriam's body. It moved with a will that bent reality around it, sliding along walls, elongating its limbs to impossible lengths, and shifting its form as though reading the fears of those who gazed upon it. Eli wrote that even his own reflection in the mirror trembled, distorted by the child's influence, as though the entity had already begun rewriting the world to fit its nature. Sister Miriam remained devoted, her frailty contrasted with the child's unearthly power. Her face, pale and lined with feverish exhaustion, reflected awe and terror simultaneously. In her eyes, Eli saw the horrifying truth. She had surrendered not to God, but to something older, something that had been waiting in the shadows of the convent for centuries. The journal ends abruptly, the final pages smeared with ink and blood. Eli's handwriting becomes jagged, fragmented, as though he had tried to capture a horror beyond language. The convent's story, he wrote, would be carried not in memory, but in silence, a legacy of fear, devotion, and a child that no human was ever meant to see.